Thank you, Maya. I think Maya is too kind, but I'm happy to be here tonight, so thank you for welcoming me here. And thanks for the great presentation. So my name is Lisa Hawk. I lead the security, privacy, and compliance function at a Series B startup called Everlaw. We are not in the SSI space, but we're in the legal technology space, offering a SaaS platform that's primarily used for investigations and e-discovery. And so I'm really interested in privacy, I'm interested in identity, and I'm interested in interviewing our panel members here tonight. So first I'm gonna ask if Greg can come up, and we're gonna do a bit of a one-on-one. Let me move the chairs back over. All right, Greg, welcome to the hot seat.
Thank you.
Let me...
Big one.
Great, so for the about 30-40 minutes here, what we've planned to do is I'm going to interview Greg one-on-one for a few minutes so that we can all get to know him and why he's passionate about this space. And then I'm going to invite John up and do the same, and then we'll bring them both back up to talk a little bit more about SSI. And so first, let me introduce Greg. Greg is the CEO and co-founder of Global ID, as well as the co-founder of Hard Yaka. And I'm really interested in learning a little bit more about his background. It's quite different, I think, for a tech leader. And so I'd like to first just start off and ask if you can tell us a little bit about your background.
Thank you. I had worked at Booz Allen, not the same part where Snowden worked back in the day, and did get introduced to a bunch of traditional industries like banking and telecoms. But somewhere along there, these banks had all these checks to deliver. They used couriers to do it, and I was working in New Zealand, and I found this world where all those checks got delivered and packages by couriers who had an identity which wasn't their name, it was just the radio. If anybody used to hear the old things, car 56 calling you, and your identity was just the radio. And everything about you was around that. And so how you got paid, how everybody talked to one another, so it was a very odd form of identity. And a marketplace existed, seekers and providers would connect, there was clearing and settlement, that spread throughout the world, became the largest on-demand dispatch network, kind of a forerunner of Uber. We learned about two things with that. We learned about text messaging, we learned about clearing and settlement. One young kid that hacked into that, who was very interested in dispatch, was a young kid named Jack Dorsey. So later on, after a stint at the Fed, at the payments group at the board, where I learned a little bit about payments, Jack came out, was living here in the Bay Area, was actually working as the nanny, and so from that came Twitter.
What a story that is.
Yeah. That came Twitter, because if you think about it, we were dispatching to bike messengers. What were we doing? We were sending out 140 characters asking who wants to do that job. Instead of having things be closed so your identity network is only bike messengers, guys with tattoos and piercings, Jack's idea was, well, why don't we just put that out there for whatever, right? For whatever. Like, well, who's going to follow that? That became Twitter. And later on, the concept of who could take a payment became Square. In each of these cases, there was a democratization. Twitter was the democratization of publishing, so anyone could be a publisher. Square was this democratization of payments, anyone could take a payment, and have stayed in that field since. So though I worked as a regulator and continue to work with other regulators, we got involved with things like the crypto movement. So I think I was first money in at Twitter. At Coinbase, I became the chief risk officer for Ripple. In each of these cases was we had these new forms of money. This was the kind of money that anybody could hold with no identity. And so there was this huge gap between these new technologies that are very transformative, but they're also very, very scary from a compliance point of view. And so the question has been, we've got these new things like blockchain, how can we make these new bottom-up technologies that are very democratizing still compliant and scalable and commercial? And so the interesting question for me is our future of how we do identity, is it going to belong to governments and corporations, or is there a way that it can be bottom-up, the same way that democratization occurred with Twitter and with Square? Can we do that now for all the other realms, whether we're controlling our wallets, our medical records, our voting, or do we have to still rely on top-down? And we've kind of seen that top-down hasn't been working so well lately.
So folks in the room here, raise your hand if you know of another tech leader who might describe themselves as a regulator. Okay, so I think this is interesting here. And so as somebody at a startup who deals with compliance, a lot of our customers are in the government space, and I came up through the regulatory and compliance world. I find it really fascinating to be talking to somebody who invested at such an early stage in really transformative technology, but with that regulator point of view. So I'm sort of interested, when it comes to SSI and the technology we're talking about now, do you think that people who have that regulatory experience, at either in the government or doing that are better suited to develop this type of technology?
Well, so in the regulatory world, they don't develop technology, they regulate it and oversee it. And over time, there have been legislation like AML, BSA, these types of regulation that try to.
We've all seen Breaking Bad, right?
Breaking Bad for money laundering or for terrorist financing, or things that are supposed to protect the privacy of your medical records. And it was kind of bad maybe 5 years ago because there was identity theft, there was money laundering, but now the breakdown of identity with social networks means that we're concerned whether the sources of media are actually fake news. Who are those identities? And so what we have now is not just the ills that we had 5 years ago, we actually have a breakdown of trust in our society. So what we've been doing has not been working, and so there is a period now when we're looking for new solutions. And when something like Facebook Libra comes along, maybe that's not the solution that people, governments, policymakers are comfortable with. So a company that's had challenges and has been fined $5 billion for privacy violations, has had a lot of security breaches, if we're going to turn to them to come up with the next identity solution, a new form of money, that may or may not be a good idea. And so if not Libra, then what are alternatives? A possible alternative is something like what sovereignists do. Rather than start with a new currency and then figure out, well, gee, maybe we need an identity solution to make sure that this doesn't end up in the hands of people that cause our society problems. Maybe you do identity first, but in a privacy and secure way that's trusted, and then you do a new form of global currency.
That would be my vote, if we're taking votes here. All right, so before I invite John up and we start the panel discussion talking more about the technology, if you had to give some advice to more early career people who might have a more non-traditional background, maybe didn't study engineering or one of the more traditional fields where you think about developers and innovators of technology, what kind of advice would you give?
Well, you always have to look for a problem to solve. Like Jack Dorsey, when we actually had a dinner over at the Pelican Inn, and Jack had no background in payments. Yeah, that's right. And he was with his partner Jim McClevey, who is a glass blower who makes these exotic faucets, and he'd lost a sale to someone who was from
another story there.
That's right, to someone from South America, because as an artist he couldn't take a card payment. He had no way to do that. And so Jack and Jim, they just asked a lot of questions like, who can make a payment, who can take a payment, and they asked like what does PayPal do? And at the time PayPal was online, it didn't work. It doesn't work really at brick and mortar type places. And obviously then everybody could make payments, but who could take payments was a much smaller population. And Jack just asked very basic questions, and then he said to me, Greg, payments are very intimate. And he's kind of he doesn't say a lot, and I did pause for a little bit, and I said, Jack, in all my years at the Federal Reserve, nobody has ever used the word payments and intimate in the same sentence. What do you mean? And Jack was like, well, you don't pay someone unless you trust them, and which is true. Usually when you're paying someone something, you trust them, and I'm like, okay, what do you mean? He says, well, most payments experiences are all based on a lack of trust between the parties. They're worried about fraud and all the friction because you can't easily prove who you are. It's kind of like, you're one of these. And so what Jack posited was what it would be like if you made payments a pleasant experience, like that most of the time payments happen between, it's like, intimate relations between married partners. They like know each other, so they don't have the same challenges as between two strangers. And he made that analogy for payments and other key transactions in life. If you could trust between the two parties to any endeavor, then every transaction could be sort of a celebration of trust between the two. And that's why Square is sort of a delightful payment experience compared to like what everything else was. And so if you're looking for a problem to solve, if you can take something that has been painful, it's like an Uber ride. At the end of the Uber ride, there's no payment. It's become invisible. It's not part of the pain anymore. If you can find a way to remove that pain, and in each of the presentations we just saw, everybody's like hunting around that removal of that pain point. If you can not just remove the pain, but you can do something that actually enshrines and reinforces trust, then you're really making a contribution. You also probably have a viable business model as well.
Great. Well, I would definitely agree with that, and I loved the presentations, and my wheels were definitely spinning into how those technologies could make my life easier, at least in certain aspects. So, all right, thank you so much, Greg. I'm going to invite John up to put him in the hot seat for just a few minutes before we start talking about SSI. So thank you, Greg, if everyone can. Welcome to the hot seat.
Thank you.
Feels a little bit game showish, but I have to tell you I'm enjoying it. So thank you so much. Let's start a little bit with your background as well, because if you've read up a little bit about John, John is on the board of Evernym, and I think he can tell us a little bit more about that as well. But if you didn't Google him before tonight, he used to teach philosophy, so I think he should tell us a little bit about how he got into the identity space from there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Greg's path to technology was not the usual path, nor was mine. I was in philosophy. I loved teaching it. It was wonderful. But I also love to make things, and philosophy is pretty abstract. So technology is this wonderful mixture of the abstract and the real, right? You can take ideas and just make them. And I found that incredible, really powerful. So I ended up at Microsoft for a few years, learned a ton, and went from there.
Well, and so I was Googling John, and being in a startup myself and dealing with corporate IT as we've grown from 25 people to 180, identity just in our company has become a big thing. And I learned that he worked with the original AD team at Microsoft. So I was going to ask him a little bit if you could tell us about that experience, because even today, you can't talk about identity without, talking about AD.
Sure. So yeah, it was a great experience being at Microsoft at that time. It was in the mid-90s when Microsoft was an incredibly innovative company. They still are, but that was really a high point for them. And there I was, not a techie, just a guy out of philosophy, and there I am talking with these incredibly brilliant people who are building Active Directory. And what I found fascinating was, and this relates back to the philosophy, these people were trying to figure out how could we build a technological system that could tell you who you are, in a sense, right? I mean, it's identity systems. They tell you who you are relative to other people, et cetera, et cetera. But Active Directory was a hierarchical system. And if you think about that and how that maybe constrains who we are, right? If the identity system tells you who you are and it's hierarchical, what does that mean? So one of the fascinating evolutions over time towards decentralized identity is perhaps a different way to unconstrain ourselves from the technology. Technology both enables and disables at the same time. That's the problem with it, right?
Yeah, definitely, and I think that's why we're all here tonight, to learn what the next evolution is and how it could impact our lives and how we can innovate around it. So, because you're in philosophy and because in your career history you've dealt with data aggregation and a lot of sort of big picture macro things, I wanted to ask you from a macro trend perspective, and I have my note to feel free to go big here. What really excites you about being in the identity space?
Right. So when you get really down to it, I was at a company that was in the telco space, and this is around 2012, and they were pivoting to ad tech. So they were buying up big companies that had huge troves of data, and they were reselling that data. They were creating identifiers, selling those identifiers. They were doing a little bit what Facebook does today, but in a more generic way. And I was getting really nervous. I was thinking, is this really the right thing to be doing? And, they were following all the laws and all of that, but remarkably, you can follow all the laws and still do a lot of scary things. It's really amazing.
That's true.
It's amazing how you can correlate data points, even when you've followed all the rules. So I started looking into what would the alternative models be. And I came across a community of people who were really thinking along these SSI lines. They weren't calling it SSI at the time, but IIW got mentioned by somebody earlier. So there's a crowd of people, just like 150 people, who have built almost all of the identity technology in the internet over the last 25 years. It's more or less the same people, the same DNA, right? So they built early TLS and SSL, then later they built OpenID, Connect, and OAuth, and now they're building SSI, right? And so there's this evolution, and all of those are actually various trust models. Everybody wanted, in a sense, to have, I think, the SSI model, even 20, 25 years ago, but no one could build it that way, and you didn't really need it at the time. But as Greg pointed out, things have gotten to a point where, oh my goodness, we are now in a situation where the technology is working against us. What can we possibly do to make this more human, right? So my interest in identity way back in AD and even way back in philosophy really got piqued by the data aggregation problem. I really got nervous about that. Started working with that community and have been working with them ever since, and hence Evernym.
Well, I mean, what better way to get interested in identity than studying philosophy, right?
Who am I, right?
Yeah. we could go
Sure.
pretty deep there, I think. So, given your own experience and your passion for the space, but also the fact that you came up through tech, via a non-traditional path, what advice would you give for, more early career folks, of all stripes who are interested in the privacy, security, or identity?
I guess I would give two, and one of them is similar to Greg's. But the first I would say is, this is what philosophy trains the mind to abstract things. Abstract things up a bit, right? Don't just get caught in the weeds, don't get caught in the details. See what the real essence of the problem, go bigger, 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 right? And then secondly, this is a version of what Greg said when he said, look for a problem. I tell people who aren't in the software business, most great software just provides efficiency. It doesn't create new human experiences. It doesn't do things that we haven't ever done before. It just does them better, faster, cheaper, etc., right? And so if you see an opportunity for efficiency, you've got a business. Simple as that.
Great. Well, it's easy, everybody. Hope you wrote that down. All right. So thank you so much,
Yep.
John. Now I'd like to invite Greg back up, and let's talk a little bit more about this specific type of technology and why we're all here tonight. So I am going
Now we're going to need 3 chairs.
Yep. Why don't we just scoot over and here. No, y'all. I think y'all are going to share the mic,
Yeah,
so I'll kind of sit over here, and I think I'm still in the view for the folks watching at home. Great. All right. So we've been talking about SSI, and I think that for anyone in the room where maybe this is new to them, or they came and they're really just interested in hearing the pitches tonight, maybe Greg, could you just kick us off with, what is it?
So, if your identity is a bundle of sticks, do you control those sticks, or is the man control the sticks? Like, is there someone that can tell you that here's your sticks, but I can take them away, or is it something that you have? And so, this is kind of an American-centric type thing. The American form, what's radical about the government was the concept that all rights belong to the people, and then people give a limited grant of authority to the government. Most other governments start with the government and then they give rights to people. And so the spirit of self-sovereign identity, it sounds like a little bit of an American-centric idea, is that people come first. There's still a role for authorities, for organizations. They can even grant credentials, but at the end of the day, I collect credentials, and my credentials might be from like other people in my address book. It might be from the the Department of Motor Vehicles, it might be from a corporation, it might be from a university. I mean, you learn what self-sovereign identity is when you have a question like, hey, I've got a reputation on Airbnb, I got a lot of good reviews. Who owns those reviews? Does Airbnb own the reviews, or do I own the reviews? Is it the fact that I earn them, or is it the fact that they sit on Airbnb's server? And so this is a question whether it's bank data, medical records, votes, who gets to decide? And so in the world of self-sovereign identity, it would be, what would the world be like if you designed it bottom up so that all these rights and really all the permissions are bottom up? And it isn't just a right. People talk rights, 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 rights. It's also responsibilities. Your permissions are worth nothing unless they're respected and seen in the eye of the beholder. Because whenever you're trying to do something with identity, you're not just doing it for yourself. You don't need identity. If it's just me, it's, hey, it's me. But when I need something from you, I want to get on your plane, or I want to get you to open an account for me, or I want you to transfer a medical record, you need to have your credentials to be good enough so that the other party can rely on them. So that's the part where it's a right, but it's also a responsibility to do enough to make the other person trust you.
All right, that is super helpful. And the next sort of $1 million question that I'm actually going to steal from John is, what does blockchain have to do with this? How is that going to help?
Well, that's a really important question. Blockchain is the thing, right, the last few years. And everybody, it's like a hammer looking for a nail. Everybody wants to use blockchain to solve every problem. I think blockchain actually is only useful for a few things. Now, maybe someone can tell me a few that I haven't noticed yet, but money's a pretty good one. Logistics, there's distributed storage, things like that. But identity, I think, is the killer app, right? And not just identity for people, it's identity for things, identity for services, identity for your multiple agents that might be in the cloud that might represent you, all sorts of things, just identifiers in general. It's the killer app for blockchain. Now, why do you need blockchain? Well, it's the Facebook problem. Facebook is wonderful, but they own your identity. Now, the beauty of Facebook, of course, is that identity gains strength over time. All these people interact with you, and it's really hard to fake that, right? And that's why that social login works on the internet. But it belongs to Facebook, and that's really disturbing. Take that web of trust model, think about how you would instantiate that with technology, and blockchain's the only way to do it. You have many, many, many nodes, you have many, many, many identifiers, and many contexts and many channels that can all interrelate with each other without a single central database, and it's still trusted. Only blockchain can do that. It's the killer app for blockchain.
So speaking of blockchain, given that we hear a lot about it, and I love that analogy about it's a hammer looking for a nail, what is blockchain really going to become mainstream? And if it doesn't, how would that impact SSI?
There's a few. Well, first of all, I mean, it already is mainstream. It's already being used to make money in various industries, for example, logistics, et cetera. IBM has a huge practice around this, et cetera. I think people worry about blockchain because they see things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and they see all these scalability problems, and it's slow, and blah, blah. Well, that's because they're dealing with things like proof of stake and proof of work, and they're really not very scalable at those current iterations. Over time, they'll get better and better at solving those problems. Things like identity can be done as public permission, where you have multiple trusted nodes, which actually host, the verifiers in the network. And so these things can scale really, really well. You also have a lot of standards-based stuff going forward. Hyperledger, hosted by Linux Foundation, billions of dollars being poured into it by big, big companies that have a lot at stake. So I think it's here to stay, and we'll just see which versions last, but it's here.
Any comments, Greg?
Well, I just say, because people worry about the scalability of blockchain, that it's not that fast. And so therefore, it doesn't meet the efficiency criteria. So why is it so important? Now, because I've dealt in regulated industries for all these years, there have been all these situations where if I wanted to innovate and do something different, I had to ask permission. So anything you do with money, up till 10 years ago, you had to ask permission, usually permission of a bank or some other regulated entity. And if they didn't want you to be in that business, then you weren't going to be in that business. And so the question is, what sort of world is it if the only innovation you can do is with permission? So one thing that Satoshi changed was he proved that there's a form of value, money, that can be operative without asking permission. It's not that it's the most efficient, but it creates a new paradigm. You can innovate for things to do with value without the need for permission. So once you know that's out there, you can have a system that maybe the top layer of what you're doing is like a bunch of things like a poker game where the chips are going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But at the end of the day, when you want to like register who won the chip count, you're going to go home at night, you need to write it down somewhere. So when you come back the next day, everybody agrees that's your stack, this is your stack. That's blockchain. So even if it's not used for every hand, at some point in time when you have to register that this is what the world was like at a state and time. So like when you shoot down that plane flying over the Ukraine and you think you've really kicked ass and you tweet, hey, we just shot down that plane, and it turns out that was a passenger plane, not a military plane, and then you want to like untweet that? Okay. Twitter is not blockchain. So the idea that you can untweet something, that you can like make it go away, that doesn't exist in blockchain. So blockchain creates a layer of trust that isn't based on trusting some authority. You don't have to trust Twitter, or you don't have to trust a government. You trust that it was written and re-verified by many other nodes. Once you know that sort of system exists in the world, even if it's not the most efficient system, you have something that didn't exist in the world 10 years ago, which a way is having trust without relying on authority. That means there's a way to innovate without having to ask permission. And simply knowing that that's out there means that people always have an alternative. It may not be the most efficient alternative, but if you're in a country or a situation where you can lose that bundle of sticks, and you know that you can load those sticks into some other form, that someone can't take them away from you, that's a new lease on life. That's something that you couldn't have imagined 10 years ago, and now that is part of our life. And that's true innovation in world history. And that's why I think that even though blockchain hasn't gone mainstream yet, as a significant point in history, it's as significant as the creation of the internet or the printing press.
So let's assume that is what transpires, and at least from an identity perspective, that we're in a world in a few years where SSI is the standard, based on blockchain. What do you think, from an individual perspective, the biggest impact will be? What do you see life being like?